The Pleasures of Ignorance by Robert Lynd. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. It is impossible to take a walk in the country with an average townsman, especially perhaps in April or May, without being amazed at the vast continent of his ignorance. It is impossible to take a walk in the country oneself without being amazed at the vast continent of one's own ignorance. Thousands of men and women live and die without knowing the difference between a beech and an elm, between the song of a thrush and the song of a blackbird. Probably in a modern city the man who can distinguish between a thrush's and a blackbird's song is the exception. It is not that we have not seen the birds. It is simply that we have not noticed them. We have been surrounded by birds all our lives. Yet so feeble is our observation that many of us could not tell whether or not the chaffinch sings or the color of the cuckoo. We argue like small boys as to whether the cuckoo always sings as he flies, or sometimes in the branches of a tree, whether Chapman drew on his fancy or his knowledge of nature in the lines, "When in the oak's green arms the cuckoo sings, and first delights men in the lovely springs." This ignorance, however, is not altogether miserable. Out of it we get the constant pleasure of discovery. Every fact of nature comes to us each spring, if only we are sufficiently ignorant, with the dew still on it. If we have lived half a lifetime without having ever seen a cuckoo, and know it only as a wandering voice, we are all the more delighted at the spectacle of its runaway flight as it hurries from wood to wood, conscious of its crimes, and at the way in which it halts hawk-like in the wind, its long tail quivering before it dares descend on a hillside of fir trees where avenging presences may lurk. It would be absurd to pretend that the naturalist does not also find pleasure in observing the life of the birds. But his is a steady pleasure, almost a sober and plodding occupation compared to the morning enthusiasm of the man who sees a cuckoo for the first time, and behold, the world is made new. And as to that, the happiness even of the naturalist depends in some measure upon his ignorance, which still leaves him new worlds of this kind to conquer. He may have reached the very Z of knowledge in the books, but he still feels half ignorant until he has confirmed each bright particular with his eyes. He wishes with his own eyes to see the female cuckoo, rare spectacle, as she lays her egg on the ground and takes it in her bill to the nest in which it is destined to breed infanticide. He would sit day after day with a field glass against his eyes in order personally to endorse or refute the evidence suggesting that the cuckoo does lay on the ground and not in a nest. And if he is so far fortunate as to discover this most secretive of birds in the very act of laying, there still remain for him other fields to conquer in a multitude of such disputed questions as whether the cuckoo's egg is always of the same color as the other eggs in the nest in which she abandons it. Assuredly the men of science have no reason as yet to weep over their lost ignorance. If they seem to know everything, it is only because you and I know almost nothing. There will always be a fortune of ignorance waiting for them under every fact they turn up. They will never know what song the siren sang to Ulysses, any more than Sir Thomas Browne did. If I have called in the cuckoo to illustrate the ordinary man's ignorance, it is not because I can speak with authority on that bird. It is simply because, passing the spring in a parish that seemed to have been invaded by all the cuckoos of Africa, I realized how exceedingly little I, or anybody else I met, knew about them. But your and my ignorance is not confined to cuckoos. It dabbles in all created things, from the sun and moon down to the names of the flowers. I once heard a clever lady asking whether the new moon always appears on the same day of the week. She added that perhaps it is better not to know, because if one does not know when or in what part of the sky to expect it, its appearance is always a pleasant surprise. I fancy, however, the new moon always comes as a surprise, even to those who are familiar with her timetables. And it is the same with the coming in of spring and the waves of the flowers. We are not the less delighted to find an early primrose, because we are sufficiently learned in the services of the year to look for it in March or April rather than in October. We know again that the blossom precedes and not succeeds the fruit of the apple tree. But this does not lessen our amazement at the beautiful holiday of a May orchard. At the same time, there is perhaps a special pleasure in relearning the names of many of the flowers every spring. It is like rereading a book that one has almost forgotten. Montaigne tells us that he had so bad a memory that he could always read an old book as though he had never read it before. I have myself a capricious and leaking memory. I can read Hamlet itself and the Pickwick Papers as though they were the work of new authors and had come wet from the press. So much of them fades between one reading and another. There are occasions on which a memory of this kind is an affliction, especially if one has a passion for accuracy. But this is only when life has an object beyond entertainment. In respect of mere luxury, it may be doubted whether there is not as much to be said for a bad memory as for a good one. With a bad memory one can go on reading Plutarch and the Arabian Nights all one's life. Little shreds and tags, it is probable, will stick even in the worst memory, just as a succession of sheep cannot leap through a gap in a hedge without leaving a few wisps of wool on the thorns. But the sheep themselves escape, and the great authors leap in the same way out of an idle memory and leave little enough behind. And if we can forget books, it is as easy to forget the months and what they showed us when once they are gone. Just for a moment I tell myself that I know May like the multiplication table, and could pass an examination on its flowers, their appearance and their order. Today I can affirm confidently that the buttercup has 5 petals. Or is it 6? I knew for certain last week. But next year I shall probably have forgotten my arithmetic, and may have to learn once more not to confuse the buttercup with the celandine. Once more I shall see the world as a garden through the eyes of a stranger, my breath taken away with surprise by the painted fields. I shall find myself wondering whether it is science or ignorance which affirms that the swift, that black exaggeration of the swallow, and yet a kinsman of the hummingbird, never settles even on a nest, but disappears at night into the heights of the air. I shall learn with fresh astonishment that it is the male and not the female cuckoo that sings. I may have to learn again not to call the campion a wild geranium, and to rediscover whether the ash comes early or late in the etiquette of the trees. A contemporary English novelist was once asked by a foreigner what was the most important crop in England. He answered without a moment's hesitation, rye. Ignorance so complete as this seems to me to be touched with magnificence. But the ignorance even of literate persons is enormous. The average man who uses a telephone could not explain how the telephone works. He takes for granted the telephone, the railway train, the linotype, the aeroplane, as our grandfathers took for granted the miracles of the Gospels. He neither questions nor understands them. It is as though each of us investigated and made his own only a tiny circle of facts. Knowledge outside the day's work is regarded by most men as a gewgaw. Still, we are constantly in reaction against our ignorance. We rouse ourselves at intervals and speculate. We revel in speculations about anything at all, about life after death, or about such questions as that which is said to have puzzled Aristotle. Why sneezing from noon to midnight was good, but from night to noon unlucky. One of the greatest joys known to man is to take such a flight into ignorance in search of knowledge. The great pleasure of ignorance is, after all, the pleasure of asking questions. The man who has lost this pleasure, or exchanged it for the pleasure of dogma, which is the pleasure of answering, is already beginning to stiffen. One envies so inquisitive a man as Jowett, who sat down to the study of physiology in his 60s. Most of us have lost the sense of our ignorance long before that age. We even become vain of our squirrel's hoard of knowledge, and regard increasing age itself as a school of omniscience. We forget that Socrates was famed for wisdom not because he was omniscient, but because he realized at the age of 70 that he still knew nothing. End of The Pleasures of Ignorance by Robert Lynd. Read by Tom Merritt.